Hello, everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we dive into the turbulent, unpredictable, and at times astonishing saga of the medieval papacy, a history where divine authority occasionally took unexpected detours through nepotism, bribery, and more than a few headline-worthy scandals. This isn't just the story of devout spiritual shepherds, it's also the tale of ambitious nobles, shrewd military tacticians, and in some cases, individuals who behaved less like saints and more like characters from a particularly outrageous soap opera, except they wore mitres and held the keys to heaven. Before we get started, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy the content, of course. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's always a delight to see the global audience tuning in from every corner of the map. Now then, dim the lights, turn on a fan if you like that comforting background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When people hear the word Pope, many imagine a serene, white-robed figure gently blessing crowds from a grand balcony, offering peace, spiritual guidance, and occasional firm reminders of morality. What doesn't usually come to mind is a teenage nobleman squandering church funds in a dice game, or a pope who had so many enemies that he literally constructed a moat around the papal palace. But welcome to the Middle Ages. In that era, the papal throne wasn't just a sacred office. It was one of the most fiercely contested power seats in Europe, second only perhaps to whichever royal throne France happened to be fighting over at the time. In theory, the Pope was the vicar of Christ, a man of deep humility, piety, and prayer. In practice, however, the papacy often operated more like a prestigious political prize passed between elite families, like a particularly opulent hot potato, one that came with armies, vast lands, chests of gold, and inevitably scandals. The chair of St. Peter wasn't only sacred, it was strategic. Whoever occupied it could crown emperors, excommunicate kings, and decide which nation God allegedly favored in any given conflict. That's a heavy mantle for one man, and an even heavier temptation, especially for those who rose to power through backdoor deals, family connections, and the occasional suspiciously enthusiastic cardinal. Not all popes were theologians or saints. Many were the younger sons of noble families, men with no military prowess and too much privilege steered into church careers like fallback options. You're no good with a sword, Benedict, but your Latin's impeccable. How about governing all of Christendom? And once in office, some of them ruled like secular monarchs, waging wars, collecting taxes, and in certain flamboyant cases, living like Renaissance playboys with spectacular wardrobes to match. Over time, the line between spiritual leadership and political maneuvering blurred, then practically disappeared. By the 10th and 11th centuries, papal elections were so riddled with scheming and betrayal that they'd make modern political dramas look like amateur hour. This is the world we're about to explore, not one of quiet contemplation, but one filled with ambition, corruption, and in at least one unforgettable instance, a courtroom trial held against a literal corpse. Let's begin with perhaps one of the most notorious examples of ecclesiastical overachievement in scandal, Pope John IV. In 955, Rome did something few would consider wise. It appointed an 18-year-old nobleman, Octavianus, to the highest spiritual office in Christianity. He took the papal name John the Weirdain, perhaps hoping it sounded more mature and less like someone who still needed help lacing up his sandals. He wasn't selected for his piety or wisdom, but because his family wielded immense power in Roman politics, enough to make the Vatican feel more like a hereditary franchise than a spiritual institution. And once in office, John treated the papacy not as a sacred responsibility, but more like an all-access pass to a very exclusive amusement park, with him holding the keys to the treasury. His conduct quickly turned him from father of Christendom into something closer to a bored aristocrat with too much power and not enough supervision. He allegedly gambled inside the Lateran Palace, drank to excess toasted pagan gods at banquets, and turned the papal residence into a chaotic blend of brothel and luxury inn. Chroniclers accused him of ordaining a deacon in a stable. His banquets blurred the lines between sacrament and sin, if such lines existed at all. One medieval writer claimed John lived like a satyr, which in diplomatic church Latin is about one step away from calling him worse than Caligula. John was also unafraid to use his position for revenge. He reportedly had one man's eyes gouged out another's tongue, cut off, raised an army lost it, begged the German Emperor Otto for help, and then betrayed him as soon as Otto's back was turned. In 964, John's story ended predictably in scandal. He died of a stroke, reportedly in bed with a married woman. Some say divine justice struck him down. Others suspect the woman's husband may have done it himself. Either way, if his job had been to bring shame upon the church, he far exceeded expectations. His antics weren't just shocking by papal standards. They were scandalous even by Roman tavern standards. Let's talk specifics of the gambling. Medieval chroniclers were aghast to learn that the Pope Christ Vicar on earth loved dice games so much he supposedly played them during papal meetings. Imagine collecting tithes while rolling for double sixes. Worse, he reportedly invoked pagan deities during game, which from a theological standpoint puts you somewhere between serious heresy and Old Testament thunderbolts incoming, and his romantic entanglements. Let's just say discretion wasn't his strong suit. He had numerous mistresses, some married, some nuns, at least one possibly just trying to deliver bread. The Lateran Palace went from being a center of clerical learning to a debauched bachelor pad with stained glass windows. Even in rituals, John was said to bless people with his left hand, which symbolically was the medieval version of giving the finger. Eventually, the nobles of Rome and the furious Emperor Otto I took action. Otto marched into Rome, deposed John, and installed a new Pope I, who at the very least was sober. But John returned like a villain in a medieval soap opera, reclaiming the papal throne through a mix of bribery, threats, and chaos. And if you thought one scandalous pope was enough for this period, think again. Enter Pope Benedict IX, a man so controversial he didn't just serve as pope once, he served 3 times. Not because of any surge in popularity, but because he treated the papacy like a personal timeshare. He first ascended to the papacy in 1032 at around age 20, some sources say younger. Still far too young to lead the Catholic world, especially when your interests include bribery orgies and treating church authority like a child swinging a scepter. His reign was plagued by such immorality that chroniclers exhausted their vocabulary trying to describe it. One wrote that Benedict feasted on the sins of the flesh, which is medieval shorthand for please someone do something. Accusations included simony, extortion, and even allowing wild animals into the papal palace, possibly metaphorical, possibly literal, which somehow makes it worse. Eventually, even his supporters had enough. In 1044, he was ousted, but returned shortly after. Then, in an almost comically corrupt twist, he sold the papacy to his godfather for gold in a peaceful retirement. Yes, he literally sold the papacy. His godfather, Pope Gregory VI, took over. The church spiraled into panic. 2 living popes now claimed legitimacy. Then, naturally, Benedict changed his mind and came back in 1047, reclaiming the throne like a man arguing over who gets the bigger bedroom in a summer house. At last, Emperor Henry III had enough. He stepped in and appointed Pope Clement II, effectively banishing Benedict forever. He remains the only person in history to have sold the papacy like a used horse cart and proved that sometimes the greatest scandal isn't lust or greed, but treating the holiest office in Christendom like a weekend gig. And if you thought the drama ended, there stay tuned, because we haven't even gotten to the popes whose stories read like medieval romance novels, complete with love affairs, jealous rivals, and full-blown family feuds. Let's return to Pope Benedict IX, by now a recurring figure in this melodrama, and someone who had claimed the papacy more times than most people managed to fill a coffee punch card. Between being exiled and reinstalled, Benedict's papal career was a revolving door of ambition, scandal, and believe it or not, romantic delusion. According to one near unbelievable account, Benedict didn't give up the papacy due to political pressure or spiritual crisis. No, he allegedly sold the highest office in Christendom because he wanted to get married. Yes, really. Apparently he had fallen in love, and in a move that can only be described as both wildly romantic and theologically horrifying, he thought resigning as pope might win her over. Spoiler alert, it did not. The unnamed woman rejected him, probably because becoming wife of a former pope doesn't come with the most socially acceptable dowry. Benedict, humiliated and still single, did what any scorned medieval pontiff might do. He tried to reclaim the papacy. Not for love this time, but out of sheer papal spite. And this wasn't even the first time romance collided with Roman politics. Earlier in the 10th century, Pope Sergius III was alleged to have had a long-standing affair with a powerful noblewoman named Marozia. Their relationship may have produced a child who later became Pope John XXI. Yes, you heard that correctly, a pope fathering a pope in defiance of more theological rules than a medieval cook ignoring Lent. The papacy during this era had become a playground for powerful Roman families, entangled in marriage alliances, vendettas, and palace intrigue. Historians dubbed the period the pornocracy, literally rule of the harlots, a scathing term but not entirely inaccurate, when you consider the sheer volume of cardinals, concubines, and cousins exchanging spiritual power like a game of musical thrones. And if you thought papal scandal ended with living popes, let me introduce you to one of the most grotesquely surreal episodes in all of church history, a moment that feels like it was co-directed by Dante and Monty Python. In the year 897, Pope Stephen VI had a serious grudge against his predecessor, Pope Formosus. The only problem, Formosus had been dead for nearly a year. But that small detail didn't deter Stephen. In one of history's most bizarre courtroom spectacles, he initiated the infamous cadaver synod, an actual trial against a corpse. Yes, a dead pope was put on trial. Stephen had Formosus's decaying body exhumed, dressed it in full papal vestments, and propped it up on a throne inside the Lateran Basilica. He then appointed a deacon to serve as the corpse's defense attorney. Imagine trying to deliver a legal argument while seated next to a decomposing skeleton dressed like a high priest. The charges: usurping the papacy, violating canon law, and essentially being pope when Stephen thought he shouldn't have been. Unsurprisingly, Formosus remained silent throughout the proceedings. He was found guilty. His papal garments were torn off, 3 fingers used for blessings were cut off, and his body was thrown into the Tiber River like a sacrilegious log. Shockingly, not everyone thought this was a reasonable use of church resources. Even by 9th century standards, this grotesque spectacle crossed a line. Riots broke out. Bishops were appalled. The Roman public, already numb to ecclesiastical drama, collectively gasped. It turns out dragging a corpse into court is where society finally drew the line. Stephen's papacy didn't last long after that. He was arrested, imprisoned, and soon after strangled in his cell, likely by someone who preferred their popes to focus on the living. His successor, Pope Romanus, took immediate steps to undo the damage. He nullified the cadaver synod, had Formosus's body retrieved from the Tiber, they eventually found it, and gave him a proper reburial, this time under much tighter security. But the damage was done. The grotesque trial had revealed just how far papal politics had strayed from its spiritual roots and into the realm of vindictive theater. For many faithful Christians, even the most devout, a troubling question emerged. Is the man in charge of our salvation emotionally stable enough to not yell at corpses? By the early 14th century, the papacy faced another transformation, not through scandal, but through strategic relocation. In 1309, under increasing political pressure, raid polite coercion from the French crown, Pope Clement V moved the papal court from riot-prone Rome to the serene, wine-soaked town of Avignon in southern France. Thus began the Avignon papacy, or as Romans might call it, that time the Pope ghosted us for 70 years. The official reason for the move was safety. Rome was chaotic, plagued by factionalism, assassinations, and Renaissance street brawls. But Avignon was comfortably within French influence, and it was no coincidence that every pope elected during this period was conveniently French. In Avignon, the papacy traded Roman grandeur for Gallic luxury. The papal court began to resemble a royal palace more than a spiritual center. Tapestries, banquets, personal chefs, and elaborate wine cellars became standard. One pope reportedly spent more money on spices than he did aiding the poor. Perhaps one could argue he was seasoning souls instead. Criticism poured in from across Christendom. Cardinals muttered about corruption. Pilgrims arrived at the empty windows of St. Peter's and asked aloud, "Is anyone home?" And the nickname stuck: the Babylonian captivity of the church. Harsh, yes, but when your holy office starts operating out of a luxury estate in Provence, people notice. In 1377, after nearly 7 decades, Pope Gregory the finally returned to Rome, but any hope of stability was short-lived. He died shortly after, and the chaos that followed was a masterclass in ecclesiastical dysfunction. The cardinals convened to elect a new pope, and in their haste to appease a furious Roman mob demanding an Italian, they elected Urban VI, who quickly alienated everyone. So the cardinals declared their own election invalid, fled to France, and elected a second pope, Clement VII. Now there were 2 popes, both claiming legitimacy. Christendom was torn. Countries picked sides. Excommunications were exchanged like holiday cards. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, a third pope was elected by a group trying to solve the problem, which predictably only made it worse. Thus began the Western Schism, an ecclesiastical crisis that had 3 simultaneous popes, all insisting they were the one true vicar of Christ. Medieval historians call it many things, but a theological dumpster fire wouldn't be far off. demanding an Italian pope with torches. In 1378, the Roman people, impatient after 70 years of papal absence in Avignon, very vocally demanded the election of an Italian pope, complete with shouting mobs and torches. The cardinals, many of them French and suddenly very nervous, hastily elected Urban VI in Italian. Crisis averted? Not quite. Urban VI turned out to be challenging. He berated the cardinals, accused everyone of conspiracy, and refused to compromise on anything. The cardinals, regretting their decision almost immediately, perhaps somewhere between the shouting and the threats, declared his election invalid, citing mob pressure and probably a collective case of indigestion. They fled Rome and elected a rival pope, Clement VII, who set up shop back in Avignon. Thus began the Western Schism, two popes each claiming to be the true vicar of Christ, each excommunicating the other with great theatrical flair and absolutely no self-awareness. It was the world's most expensive and spiritually confusing divorce, except instead of splitting assets, they split Europe. France, Spain, and Scotland backed Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy stuck with Rome. Bishops were baffled. Parishioners were torn. Salvation began to feel like a question of geography. The two-pope system limped along for decades, causing division, political chaos, and no small amount of theological whiplash. Then in 1409, a council in Pisa attempted to resolve the crisis by firing both popes and electing a third, Alexander IV. Unfortunately, the original two popes refused to step down. So for a brief and glorious moment, the Catholic Church had three popes each, proclaiming themselves the only legitimate successor to St. Peter, each excommunicating the other two, and none of them willing to share the holy hat. Finally, in 1417, the Council of Constance brought the spiritual circus to a close. Through a mix of diplomacy, pressure, and probably divine exhaustion, all three papal claimants were removed or convinced to resign. Pope Martin V was elected the first uncontested pope in nearly 40 years, likely with the informal agreement that he please not do anything insane for at least a week. Enter Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope. And if you thought the papacy couldn't possibly outdo corpse trials, papal sales, and theological three-ways, may I present Rodrigo Borgia, better known as Pope Alexander VI. Elected in 1492, yes, the same year Columbus set sail, Alexander wasn't so much a shepherd of souls as he was a Renaissance crime boss in robes. His election involved piety, of course, and a historic number of bribes. Cardinals were allegedly offered palaces, gold, and perhaps a few foot rubs in exchange for their support. It was less a conclave and more a high-stakes ecclesiastical Black Friday. Once installed, Alexander ran the Vatican like a family-owned cartel. And I do mean family. He openly acknowledged several children, most notably Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, which for a pope sworn to celibacy was bold. But Alexander didn't just acknowledge them, he promoted them. Cesare got military campaigns. Lucrezia got political marriages. Where other popes hid their offspring, the Borgias turned nepotism into an art form. Alexander was a master manipulator. He played France and Spain against each other like pieces on a chessboard, often promising both kings completely opposite things sealed with a papal bull and possibly a bottle of Vatican wine. Church funds were treated as a personal war chest, financing military expeditions, luxurious feasts, and family real estate ventures. The Vatican under Alexander became infamous for its decadence, masked balls, lavish banquets, and rumors of orgies in the Apostolic Palace. The term Borgia poison wasn't always metaphorical. More than one rival mysteriously died after dinner. And yet, for all his scandal, Alexander VI was highly effective. He stabilized Vatican finances, expanded papal territories, and strengthened political alliances. If the papacy were a company, he ran it like a ruthless CEO with a dagger behind the desk and a fresco of the Last Supper on the wall. He died in 1503 of malaria poison or karma, depending on the source. His legacy remains one of contradiction, grotesquely immoral but politically brilliant. A warlord in silk, draped in scandal, crowned by history. Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, siblings of scandal. When your father is the Pope and arguably the most power-hungry man in Europe, your childhood probably won't involve picnics and lullabies. For Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, life was an operatic swirl of diplomacy, daggers, and strategic marriages, all under the decorative ceiling of the Vatican. Let's start with Cesare, the original prince of the church turned actual prince of war. Made a cardinal at just 18 years old because nothing screams spiritual maturity like adolescence. Cesare soon traded red robes for plate armor. After his brother Giovanni died mysteriously, many suspected Cesare He resigned his position and reinvented himself as a military commander. Funded by church coffers and backed by Dad Cesare, cut a bloody path across central Italy, conquering cities, crushing rivals, and crafting what might be called Renaissance Grand Theft Auto Vatican Edition. As for Lucrezia, she remains one of history's most misrepresented women. Depending on your source, she was either a brilliant political pawn or a scheming poisoner with flair. The truth is likely somewhere in between. She married 3 times not for love, but for diplomacy. One marriage was annulled, another ended in murder. Cesare again possibly, and the third stuck long enough for her to become Duchess of Ferrara and a respected patron of the arts. Rumors of incest poison and secret lovers followed her like incense smoke. While most of it was likely political slander, when you're the daughter of a pope and your brother is building a private army, it's hard to avoid scandal entirely. Together, Cesare and Lucrezia became the most infamous siblings of the Renaissance, dangerous, dazzling, and immortalized in frescoes with expressions that suggest they know where the bodies are buried. Through it all, Pope Alexander VI watched proudly like a stage father at a blood-soaked ballet. The warrior Pope Julius II. By the time Pope Julius II took office in 1503, the papacy had already weathered every kind of scandal imaginable, from corpse trials to nepotism-fueled dynasties. Julius, however, had no interest in subtlety or sin. He preferred swords. Known as the warrior pope, Julius wasn't content to sit on a throne. He led armies into battle wearing full armor. Not spiritually, literally. Born Giuliano della Rovere, he seized the papacy with one hand on his mitre and the other on his sword. His goals, power art and warrior cosplay. He personally commanded campaigns to reclaim papal territories, shouted down rebellious cardinals like a Latin drill sergeant, and cursed like a soldier. When critics asked if a pope should really be waging war, Julius essentially replied, "Hold my chalice." Yet Julius had another obsession, the arts. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, a job the artist hated so much he wrote angry poems while suspended on scaffolding. Julius, ever encouraging, would climb up and yell at him for being slow. He also hired Raphael to decorate his private apartments and laid the foundation for the new St. Peter's Basilica. His reign was loud, lavish, and militaristic, like a Renaissance blockbuster funded by indulgences. But by the time of his death in 1513, Julius had left behind a legacy of architectural splendor and a more centralized, more powerful church. Final thoughts. From simony to sibling warfare, from corpse trials to French exiles, the medieval and Renaissance papacy was less a quiet spiritual institution and more a rotating stage of ambition, chaos, and drama. Behind the incense and Latin chants were sword scandals and strategies that shaped the fate of Europe. Was it divine providence or political theater? Maybe both. But one thing's for sure, no one throws a power struggle quite like the medieval papacy, especially when the holy hat is on the line. Leo Toro, the Medici who made the Vatican fabulous. If Pope Julius II was the iron-fisted general charging into battle, Pope Leo the Fiend was the silk-slippered aristocrat waltzing into the papacy like it was his family villa. Born Giovanni de' Medici, Leo didn't so much climb the ecclesiastical ladder as much as he rode its side-saddle humming madrigals. The first pope from the illustrious Medici family, he brought with him Florence's flair for art luxury and a budgetary approach best described as optimistic. Upon his election in 1513, Leo famously declared, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." Perhaps not canon law, but certainly on brand. Enjoy it he did. Under Leo, the Vatican transformed into the most exclusive social club in Europe. Banquets, theater performances, exotic pets, and enough Renaissance decor to bankrupt a duchy. Among his prized possessions, an elephant named Hanno, who was so beloved that Leo had a custom marble palace built for him. Feeding the poor maybe next week. Hanno's fruit platter came first. But Leo's indulgences weren't just metaphorical. Faced with a growing hole in church finances, thanks again, Julius Leo revived an old fundraising classic, the sale of indulgences. These were literal get-out-of-purgatory documents available for a price. Sin now, pay later. It was salvation by transaction, and business was booming. Until a certain grumpy monk in Germany decided to ruin everything. Martin Luther, a monk with a nail and an attitude. Martin Luther, unimpressed by the Vatican's celestial pricing scheme, responded in 1517 by nailing his famous 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. It was less a complaint and more an ecclesiastical mic drop. He accused Leo and the church of selling forgiveness like a butcher hawking sausage, and while Leo initially dismissed him as a drunk German who will change his mind, when sober spoiler he didn't. Instead, the Protestant Reformation was born. Leo excommunicated Luther in 1521, but by then the damage was done. The Church's monopoly on grace was slipping through its gilded fingers, and the printing press made sure the whole continent was in on the scandal. Leo died later that same year officially of pneumonia, though some whispered eel-related complications, which feels poetically appropriate for a pope whose reign was indulgent in every sense of the word. Humorism bleed, first ask questions later. For over a millennium, Western medicine was governed not by cells or science, but by four mysterious bodily fluids: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This theory, known as humorism, was the ancient world's grand medical hypothesis. First pitched by Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE and elaborated by Galen during the Roman Empire, it suggested that good health came from keeping these fluids in balance. Illness. Clearly one humor had gone rogue. Each humor was linked to everything from the seasons to personality types. Blood warm and moist linked to spring and a cheerful disposition. Yellow bile hot and dry, summer and anger. Black bile cold and dry, autumn and melancholy. Phlegm cold and wet, winter and sluggishness. If you felt sad, physicians didn't recommend therapy. They'd suggest dietary changes or maybe a purge to balance your melancholic black bile. And if things got really serious, there was always the nuclear option: bloodletting. Doctors, or more often your local barber, would open a vein or apply leeches to remove excess blood. It was the medical equivalent of hitting reset with a kitchen knife. In theory, it balanced the humors. In reality, it often made things worse. George Washington in 1799 had nearly half his blood drained during his final illness. Shockingly, he did not recover. Yet the practice persisted for centuries. Why? Because it looked like medicine. The rituals, the charts, the dramatic visuals, patients saw their doctors doing something. And sometimes by sheer luck or placebo, it even helped. Just not often. Miasma, death in the air. Before anyone understood germs, people had another explanation for disease: miasma, or bad air. The belief was that illness came not from invisible microbes, but from foul-smelling vapors rising from swamps, garbage, and unburied corpses. Or more subtly, from immoral behavior. If it stank, it could kill you. This wasn't fringe science, it was mainstream from ancient Greece through Victorian London. The word miasma comes from the Greek for pollution, and it guided public health for over 1,000 years. During the Black Death in the 14th century, doctors donned their now iconic beaked plague masks filled with herbs and flowers, not as fashion statements, but as primitive gas masks. Cities burned incense in the streets. Bonfires were lit to clean the air. Some towns even moved cemeteries, assuming the dead were leaking sickness into the atmosphere. And to be fair, while miasma theory was wrong about the cause, it sometimes led to accidentally smart policies like improved sanitation and urban planning. Still, the core idea that scent could kill meant that smell became a stand-in for science. The poorer and smellier your neighborhood, the more likely it was to be blamed for outbreaks. Odor became class warfare wrapped in pseudoscience. Final thoughts. From papal elephants to plague masks, from indulgent popes with elephants and war-hungry pontiffs in armor to centuries of leech therapy and plague masks stuffed with lavender, the pre-modern world was a kaleidoscope of brilliant ideas, bad science, and deeply human attempts to understand the unknown. The Church may have claimed eternal truths, but its leaders often behaved like aristocrats, generals, or mafia dons. Meanwhile, medicine marched forward, sometimes heroically, sometimes in circles, with the occasional detour into bloodletting by moonlight. What ties it all together is a persistent, unquenchable desire for control over life, death, disease, and destiny. Whether it's balancing humors, selling indulgences, or burning herbs to fight the plague, the thread running through history is clear. Even when we didn't know what we were doing, we desperately needed to believe that we did. Avicenna, the rationalist in a world of ritual. In a time when much of medicine was a cocktail of charms, chanting, and occasionally crocodile dung, Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, to the Islamic world, stood as a lighthouse of logic. Born in 980 CE in what is now Uzbekistan, he was a polymath fluent in philosophy, astronomy, chemistry, psychology, and medicine before most people today master algebra. His magnum opus, the Canon of Medicine, didn't just catalog diseases, it systematized them with breathtaking clarity. Avicenna didn't simply inherit Greek medical thought. He organized, critiqued, and expanded it. The canon read like a medical instruction manual for a civilization still fumbling through trial and error. Broken into 5 volumes, it included definitions and classifications of diseases, diagnostic methods, rules for pharmacology, detailed descriptions of over 700 drugs, preventive measures including hygiene and mental health advice. And though still working within the outdated humoral theory, Avicenna added rigor and skepticism. He emphasized clinical observation, argued for evidence-based medicine, and insisted on testing medications in controlled environments centuries before randomized trials became a thing. He even flirted with early germ theory, noting that diseases could spread through water, soil, and air. In some cases, he advocated for quarantine, putting him philosophically closer to Pasteur than many of his medieval contemporaries. For centuries, the canon was used as the gold standard in medical schools across Europe and the Islamic world. While the content was eventually superseded, the approach, rational, structured, and evidence-oriented, helped lay the foundation for modern medical science. From mummies to microbes, a journey through medicine's awkward adolescence. If we were to sum up pre-modern medicine in one phrase, it would be deeply creative, occasionally brilliant, often terrifying. From bloodletting and mercury pills to poisonous contraceptives and elephant-owning popes, the history of healing is a parade of contradictions, driven by the desperate need to cure, guided by symbolism and tradition, hampered by limited tools and flawed models, but occasionally struck gold through accidental insight or dogged observation. Whether it was the Egyptians embalming their way into anatomical knowledge, the Greeks mapping the soul through fluids, Renaissance physicians diagnosing via astrology, or Islamic scholars like Avicenna building libraries of wisdom, each era added something valuable, even if wrapped in layers of myth, magic, or madness. Medicine today owes its existence not just to scientific revolutionaries, but to centuries of trial, error, and sheer human persistence, and maybe a little luck. After all, some of our ancestors really did believe that drinking melted gold or snorting mummy powder would cure their ailments, and they lived long enough for us to eventually figure out better, precious, order, logic, and a systematic way to learn from patients. In short, he didn't banish the myths, but he brought medicine out of the fog and onto a path of critical thinking. For that alone, Avicenna earned his place in the Hall of Medical Giants. If Hippocrates was the father of medicine, Galen was its long-reigning emperor. Born in 129 CE in the Roman Empire, Galen became the most influential medical thinker of the ancient world. So influential, in fact, that his errors shaped medicine for over a millennium. Galen was brilliant, yes, but he was also spectacularly wrong in ways that haunted Western medicine deep into the Renaissance. Galen believed in the four humors, but he took the theory to theatrical new heights. He insisted that each organ had a primary humor, that diseases were caused by humoral imbalances, and that restoring equilibrium required precise treatments like bloodletting, purging, or diet manipulation. His anatomical writings were considered gospel. But here's the twist. He never dissected a human body. Roman law forbade it, so Galen relied on animal dissection, mostly monkeys and pigs. The result, a cascade of flawed assumptions. He believed the liver produced blood, which then traveled to the rest of the body through invisible pores in the heart. He thought the brain cooled the blood like a radiator, and that the heart didn't circulate blood. It just absorbed and distributed it. These were not small mistakes. They became foundational doctrines for 400 years. Despite this, Galen wasn't just a blind follower of dogma. He emphasized empirical observation, conducted experiments, and even used logical deduction in diagnosis. He was a prolific writer, producing hundreds of texts that combined medicine, philosophy, and anatomy. His work was so voluminous and authoritative that later scholars dared not challenge him. To do so was almost heresy. In the Islamic world, Galen's texts were translated into Arabic and later into Latin, becoming standard curriculum in medieval European universities. But with reverence came stagnation. For centuries, medical students learned how to confirm Galen, not how to question him. Dissecting a human corpse and finding inconsistencies must be the corpse that's wrong, not Galen. It wasn't until the Renaissance and figures like Andreas Vesalius that Galen's anatomical errors were finally debunked through direct human dissection, when blood was discovered to circulate, not just seep. Medicine was finally unshackled from his grip. Galen's legacy is a paradox, a brilliant thinker whose devotion to logic and observation inspired generations, yet whose mistakes delayed key medical breakthroughs for centuries. In the end, he reminds us that knowledge must always be questioned, even when it comes from a genius with a scalpel. In the West, ancient medicine leaned heavily on bodily fluids and bloodletting. But in the East, particularly in ancient China, medicine took an entirely different route, one based on invisible energy flowing rivers of life force and carefully placed needles. Enter acupuncture, a practice that's over 2,000 years old and still used today despite its mysterious and sometimes misunderstood origins. At the heart of acupuncture is the concept of qi, pronounced qui, the life force or energy that flows through the body along invisible channels called meridians. Illness, according to ancient Chinese belief, occurs when qi is blocked, imbalanced, or weakened. The cure restores the proper flow, and that's where acupuncture comes in. By inserting thin needles at specific points on the body, practitioners aim to redirect and harmonize qi, unblocking the body's internal traffic jams. The earliest references to acupuncture appear in texts like the Hanging the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, written around the 2nd century BCE. This foundational work described meridians, acupuncture points, and how different organs corresponded with elements like fire, earth, and water. It wasn't based on anatomy as we know it. There were no blood vessels or nerves in these meridians. Instead, it was a system rooted in balance, harmony, and observation of nature. Despite the mystical language, acupuncture did produce observable effects. It could reduce pain, induce relaxation, and in some cases improve recovery, likely due to the body's own endorphin release and nervous system responses. In ancient times, these effects were interpreted as evidence that qi had been restored. Acupuncture wasn't used alone. It was part of a larger framework of traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, which included herbal remedies, dietary regulation, cupping therapy, and moxibustion, burning herbs near the skin. The goal was always the same: to restore internal balance and sync the body with the natural world. Western medicine remained skeptical for centuries, especially because acupuncture's anatomical claims didn't match scientific models. But in the modern era, studies have shown that while meridians may not exist physically, acupuncture can influence the nervous system, reduce chronic pain, and even help with nausea or migraines. It's not magic. It's biology reframed. For all the bizarre rituals, dangerous substances, and downright mythical theories that shaped ancient medicine, not everything was a shot in the dark. In fact, some ancient treatments born from careful observation, experimentation, or pure necessity were surprisingly effective. And in a few cases, modern science has circled all the way back to say they were onto something. Let's start with honey. Used in ancient Egypt, Greece, and China as a wound dressing, honey was prized for its sweetness and its antibacterial properties. Today we know that honey contains enzymes that produce hydrogen peroxide, making it effective against certain bacteria. It also keeps wounds moist and forms a protective barrier. Modern medicine now uses medical-grade honey for burns and ulcers, proving that not all sticky cures are superstition. Ancient Indian physicians, particularly those practicing Ayurveda, promoted the use of turmeric for inflammation and digestion. Modern studies have confirmed that curcumin, the active compound in turmeric, has anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. It doesn't cure everything as once claimed. But it's not just spice cabinet snake oil either. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest known Egyptian medical texts, included treatments for constipation, parasites, and even depression. Some recipes involve castor oil, garlic, and willow bark, the last of which contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin. That's right. Long before Bayer-marketed little white pills, ancient Egyptians were chewing on nature's painkiller. In China, herbalists used mahang ephedra to treat asthma and congestion. Its active ingredient, ephedrine, was later isolated and used in modern decongestants and stimulants until it was banned in many countries due to misuse. Still, it showed that even without a molecular understanding, ancient physicians could identify potent compounds through trial and error. The Greeks, particularly Hippocrates, emphasized diet and lifestyle as medicine. "Let food be thy medicine," he supposedly said. And while modern nutrition science is far more complex, the core idea that health begins with what we consume remains profoundly true. Even practices like quarantine, used in ancient Persia and recommended by Avicii, showed early awareness of disease transmission long before germ theory existed. Imagine working a full month harvesting crops, building temples, or copying texts, and instead of coins or digital deposits, you're paid in sacks of barley. Welcome to ancient Mesopotamia, where economics ran not on cash, but on grain. This wasn't a barter system. It was a remarkably organized, centrally controlled economic structure, with temples and palaces acting as proto-bureaucracies, and in many ways early banks. In places like Uruk and Lagash, salaries were calculated based on social status, profession, and productivity. A high-ranking temple official might receive hundreds of liters of grain per month, while a laborer received enough for subsistence. Alongside barley wages could also be paid in beer oil wool or even bread. These items weren't randomly chosen. They were commodities with stable value and constant demand. Think of them as the gold standards of Mesopotamian daily life. But how did anyone keep track of all this grain flowing through the economy? Enter the mighty clay tablet covered in cuneiform script. These early accounting records listed workers' names, tasks, rations, and even tax payments. The scribes, essentially the accountants of their day, used standardized measures and symbols. One tablet might read 2 workers 5 days 3 ela of barley per day, multiplied over thousands of laborers. You can imagine the scale of coordination required. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were economic engines. They controlled vast tracts of land, employed thousands, and stored food supplies for redistribution. Workers toiled in temple fields, herded temple livestock, and repaired temple walls, all in exchange for rations. And because the temple issued those rations, it controlled both labor and livelihood. The state and religion were fused in economic policy. There was even a system of credit and interest. Need extra grain. To survive the winter, borrow from the temple, with interest often calculated in kind. Can't pay it back? You risk debt slavery or the loss of your land. The earliest versions of usury laws and debt forgiveness emerged in this period. Some kings, recognizing the danger of runaway debt, periodically erased obligations in grand gestures of economic reset, what we might call a jubilee. If Mesopotamia ran on barley, ancient Egypt ran on the Nile and its grain. The river wasn't just a water source. It was the economic backbone of the entire civilization. Each year, the Nile's flood deposited fertile silt along its banks, enabling large-scale agriculture. And from this reliable rhythm came one of history's most centralized and state-controlled economies. Egypt didn't use coins until the very end of the Pharaonic period. For most of its history, it functioned on a redistribution economy. Farmers paid a portion of their harvest, usually grain, as tax to the state. That grain was then stored in massive state granaries, some of which could hold enough to feed entire cities. These granaries acted as economic buffers, especially in times of famine, drought, or political instability. Instead of private banking, Egypt's economy flowed through the pharaoh and his bureaucracy. The vizier oversaw economic planning, with scribes dispatched across the kingdom to assess crop yields and collect taxes. Everything was documented in fine detail, from field sizes to weather conditions. If a farmer failed to meet his quota, he might be flogged or fined. The records didn't lie. Grain wasn't just food, it was currency. Workers who helped build temples or pyramids weren't paid in gold, but in rations, loaves of bread, beer, and onions. A laborer's daily wage might include 5 loaves and 2 jugs of beer, considered both sustenance and compensation. Even craftsmen and priests were compensated in kind, with higher rations according to rank. The state also set prices. There are surviving lists showing the relative values of goods. How many sacks of grain for a goat? How many loaves of bread for a pair of sandals? This wasn't a free market, but a controlled pricing system designed to ensure order in trade and stability in society. Wealth was measured less in metal and more in land and grain. Nobles with large estates could accumulate enormous power, but the pharaoh always had final claim. During times of scarcity, the state would reopen the granaries, both as a tool of mercy and as a way to reassert authority. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Greeks introduced something that would forever reshape economic history: coins. Real stamped metal currency used not just for taxes or temples, but for daily transactions in bustling markets. This wasn't just a technological innovation, it was a psychological one. It created trust and value backed not by grain or gods, but by a shared idea of worth hammered into silver and bronze. The earliest Greek coins emerged around the 7th century BCE in Lydia. But it was the city-states of mainland Greece, like Athens, Corinth, and Aina, that developed monetary economies. Athens, for instance, minted the famous owl tetrads made of pure silver mined from the Laurian mines in Attica. These coins weren't just currency, they were propaganda. The owl, symbolizing wisdom in Athena, reminded users of where the coin came from and who guaranteed its value. Coins enabled rapid trade and taxation. Instead of hauling grain or livestock, merchants could pay port fees or soldiers with a handful of coins. And crucially, coins allowed for standardized value. This was especially important in pan-Hellenic trade networks, where dozens of city-states with different economies still needed to conduct business. A coin with a recognizable stamp became a passport of trust. But Greek economics wasn't just about shiny coins and markets. Wealth inequality was a chronic issue. In many city-states, including Athens, land was concentrated in the hands of a few, while indebted farmers struggled to survive. That's why reformers like Solon famously canceled debts and banned debt slavery, moves that weren't just humanitarian, but essential for social stability. There were also early experiments in price control and rationing. In times of war or famine, some pollers imposed limits on bread prices or restricted grain exports. The state wasn't afraid to step in when the market turned cruel, and it wasn't just the government using economics strategically. Temples were major economic players too. Sanctuaries like Delphi or Delos operated as financial centers, holding treasuries, lending money, and even issuing receipts. Religion and economy were entwined, just with more marble. Greek philosophy also influenced economic thought. Plato and Aristotle wrote about the dangers of usury, the morality of profit, and the ideal balance between self-sufficiency and commerce. Economics for them wasn't just math, it was ethics. In Greece, the coin was born. But so was the debate. How do you manage wealth, power, and fairness in a world where money now moves faster than grain? By the time Rome rose to power, the ancient economy had entered a new phase, imperial scale. The Roman Republic and later the Empire oversaw vast territories stretching from Britain to Egypt. With this expansion came an enormous challenge: how to fund the machine that kept legions marching, aqueducts flowing, and emperors firmly in power. At the heart of Rome's economic engine was taxation. Unlike earlier civilizations where payments were made in grain or goods, Rome relied heavily on coinage, especially after the silver denarius became the standard. Citizens paid taxes in coins while provinces paid tribute, often collected in precious metals or bulk commodities. And if you were conquered, you paid for the privilege of losing. Tax collection, however, wasn't always neat. Rome often used a system called tax farming. Wealthy private individuals known as publicani would pay the state up front for the right to collect taxes in a region. Whatever they gathered beyond that sum was their profit. Unsurprisingly, this led to abuse and extortion, especially in distant provinces where oversight was weak. Cicero himself railed against corrupt tax farmers in his speeches. The empire also maintained a military payroll that dwarfed anything in the ancient world. Soldiers were paid in coins and land grants, a powerful incentive for loyalty. The state minted millions of coins annually, drawing silver from mines in Spain and gold from DEA. But maintaining this system was expensive. When revenues dipped, emperors often debased the currency, reducing silver content to stretch the supply. This practice, while temporarily effective, it led to inflation and public distrust. Rome's economy wasn't all taxes and war. There was a vibrant market economy, especially in urban centers. Markets were filled with imported luxuries: silk from China, pepper from India, glassware from Egypt. Trade was facilitated by Roman roads, ports, and a relatively safe Mediterranean, dubbed me Nostrum Marci. State-controlled grain docks in cities like Rome provided free or subsidized bread to thousands, keeping the poor fed and politically quiet. Wealth inequality, however, was stark. The elite senatorial class owned vast latifundia, or plantations worked by slaves. Small farmers were often driven into debt or absorbed by larger estates. Economic mobility was limited and prosperity flowed upward. Rome showed the world what a monetized, centralized economy could look like. But it also revealed the cracks: inflation, exploitation, and a growing gap between the taxed and the taxing. Sound familiar? Some problems, it seems, are timeless. As the Roman Empire marched into the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, its economy began to wobble, then crack. Trade networks strained, military costs ballooned, and worst of all, confidence in the imperial currency collapsed. The story of late Roman economics is a cautionary tale of what happens when a government tries to fix a financial crisis by tampering with its own money. The early silver denarius, once the bedrock of Roman commerce, had steadily lost value. In a desperate attempt to pay soldiers and public officials, emperors began to debase the coinage, diluting the silver content with cheaper metals like copper and lead. A coin that once held real value became little more than a metal token. Trust eroded, prices rose, and suddenly inflation wasn't just a word. It was daily reality. By the time of Emperor Delasian in the late 3rd century, inflation was spiraling. Bread that once cost 1 coin could now cost 100 pentarn. In response, Diocletian issued the infamous Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 CE. This massive decree attempted to fix prices on everything from wheat to labor to line meat. It even set maximum wages for professions. Violation of the edict could mean death. Sounds decisive, but it failed spectacularly. Sellers refused to part with goods at government-mandated prices. The black market exploded and enforcement became nearly impossible. The edict faded into irrelevance, a monument to how command economics can't override supply and demand. To stabilize the chaos, Diocletian and later Constantine attempted monetary reform. Diocletian introduced new coins like the aureus, and Constantine launched the solidus, a gold coin that would actually endure for centuries as a stable currency. But for everyday people, especially in the provinces, access to stable coinage remained limited. Most still relied on barter or hoarded older coins with real silver content. Meanwhile, the empire's economy became more autarkic, self-contained. Large estates grew their own food, crafted their own tools, and distanced themselves from the volatile market. This shift marked the beginning of the memorial economy that would dominate the Middle Ages. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the eastern half, Byzantium, kept the imperial torch burning both politically and economically. Centered in Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire didn't just survive for another 1,000 years. It preserved and refined Roman economic systems, but it walked a constant tightrope between control and collapse, micromanagement, and market forces. At the heart of Byzantine stability was the solidus, a gold coin introduced by Constantine. Remarkably, it maintained its weight and purity for over 700 years. Known in Western Europe as the bezant, the solidus became the most trusted international currency of its time. Merchants in Baghdad, Venice, and even China accepted it. In a world riddled with debased currencies, Byzantium's gold was pure and its reputation priceless. But that didn't mean the economy ran on layer principles. Quite the opposite. The Byzantine state was famously interventionist. It set official prices for bread, wine, oil, and other staples. In Constantinople, the annona system inherited from Rome ensured that grain shipments from Egypt and other provinces fed the capital regularly, free of market volatility. This was a political necessity. If bread disappeared or prices spiked, riots followed. The people of Constantinople were famously not shy about their dissatisfaction. The empire also maintained a highly sophisticated bureaucracy, including tax officials, grain inspectors, and urban price controllers. Farmers paid taxes partly in produce and partly in cash, while soldiers and bureaucrats were paid in gold, ensuring both loyalty and liquidity. But the Byzantine economy was also deeply stratified. Wealth concentrated in powerful landowning families, many of whom received tax exemptions. The result, a shrinking tax base and growing burden on smallholders and peasants. Some emperors, like Basil the Cum, cracked down on aristocratic privilege to protect the treasury. Others, less disciplined, handed out land grants and exemptions, like candy, destabilizing the system in the long run. Trade flourished, especially in luxury goods, silk, spices, and religious icons. The state even tried to control who could produce and sell certain items. Guilds were tightly regulated. Silk, for example, was originally a state monopoly. The empire feared that losing control of it meant losing control of both wealth and diplomacy. While the Mediterranean world was calculating taxes in denarii and hoarding solidi, ancient China was quietly developing one of the most sophisticated and long-lasting economic systems in human history. Centered around agriculture, particularly rice and millet, China's economy also birthed radical innovations, standardized coinage, bureaucratic taxation, and even the world's first paper money. In early dynasties like the Zhou and Qin, land ownership was tied directly to tax obligations. Farmers paid their dues in grain or labor, either to the state or local lords. But as China unified under the Han Dynasty, the state expanded control over trade, resource extraction, and money. Taxes were streamlined into three forms: land tax, a share of your harvest, labor tax, days spent working on public projects, and tribute tax in kind or cash. This system supported an enormous bureaucracy, one staffed by educated officials, chosen via imperial examinations, a meritocratic concept far ahead of its time. Currency came early. The banan coin, a round copper piece with a square hole, was one of the first standardized currencies issued under the Qin dynasty. It wasn't just money. Ta was a symbol of unity. Later dynasties like the Tang and Song improved the system further, using bronze and later iron coins, which were strung together in hundreds to make large purchases. But innovation didn't stop at metal. During the Song dynasty, as trade exploded and merchants found hauling coins cumbersome, China invented something revolutionary: paper money called gyasi. These notes were initially issued by private merchants and later adopted by the state. By the 11th century, government-issued paper currency was in full circulation nearly 1,000 years before Europe caught up. The state kept a tight grip on salt, iron, and tea, often monopolizing production and controlling prices. Trade was both local and international. China's Silk Road linked it to Persia and Rome, while maritime trade reached as far as Africa. Despite innovations, China wasn't immune to inflation or economic imbalance. Overproduction of paper money under the Yuan dynasty eventually led to currency devaluation and public distrust. Still, the foundational principles of land-based taxation, bureaucratic management, and currency control gave China an economic continuity the West could only envy. In ancient India, economics took a uniquely spiritual turn. While other civilizations funneled wealth through kings or emperors, India's wealth often flowed through temples. These were not just houses of worship. They were financial institutions, landowners, employers, and even local banks. At the same time, bustling urban centers and far-flung trade routes were energized by merchant guilds, some of which functioned with near-sovereign independence. Temples in regions like Tamil Nadu or Karnataka amassed wealth through donations of gold, land, and livestock. A king or noble might donate an entire village to a temple, complete with its people fields and tax rights. These temples then reinvested. They lent grain, leased land, employed artisans, and managed irrigation. Inscriptions reveal loans made with interest, repaid in kind or coin. In effect, the priestly elite became fiscal managers, blending ritual with revenue. India's economy was also deeply entwined with religious festivals and pilgrimages. Towns like Varanasi or Madurai drew massive crowds during holy days, sparking surges in local trade. Vendors, performers, farmers, and financiers all benefited. For many pilgrims, the spiritual journey doubled as an economic one. Parallel to the temples were the merchant guilds known as shreni. These were tightly organized professional associations: blacksmiths, weavers, spice traders, each regulating prices, quality, and wages. Some even had their own codes of conduct and internal courts. More impressively, certain guilds accumulated enough capital to lend money to kings fund temple construction or send trading caravans across borders. Think of them as early corporations, self-regulating, self-financing, and deeply influential. India also maintained robust long-distance trade networks through ports like Lothal, Tamaripta in Peru. Goods like spices, gemstones, ivory, and textiles traveled to Persia, Rome, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Indian merchants used a variety of currencies: punch-marked silver coins, copper tokens, and even cowrie shells in certain regions. But economic life wasn't all opulence. The caste system rigidly dictated economic roles, limiting upward mobility. A potter's son became a potter, a merchant's son a merchant. While some flexibility existed in practice, institutional change was rare. As we look across the ancient world, from Mesopotamian barley wages to Byzantine price controls, one thing becomes clear: human economies have always been about more than money. They are systems of trust, power, belief, and survival. And though they varied in scale and sophistication, ancient economies confronted many of the same problems we face today: debt crisis, inflation, inequality, and resource distribution. Debt, for instance, was a recurring theme. In Mesopotamia, debt could lead to enslavement, but kings often forgave debts and grant amnesties. In Athens, farmers burdened by debt were rescued by Solon's reforms. In Rome, overindebtedness fueled civil unrest and populist uprisings. Again and again, ancient societies had to confront a simple truth: when too much wealth accumulates at the top, the system cracks. Inequality wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Most wealth, whether land, grain, or coin, was concentrated in the hands of a few. Empires like Rome or India saw small farmers slowly crushed under taxes and competition from elite landowners. The result: widening social divides, political instability, and eventual decline. Sound familiar? Inflation was another universal plague. Rome's currency collapse in the 3rd century mirrors modern fears about money printing. The Byzantines tried to hold the line with the solidus, while China swung between innovation and overreach with paper money. These civilizations show us that trust in currency is fragile and, once lost, difficult to restore. Yet there's also a lesson in resilience. Ancient economies were incredibly adaptive. When coinage failed, people returned to barter. When the market collapsed, communities leaned on temples or guilds. When central control wavered, local systems filled the gap. The absence of modern banks didn't mean chaos, it meant creativity. Another takeaway: economics was always social. It wasn't just about markets and production, but rituals, festivals, kinship networks, and cosmic order. A temple's vault, a farmer's field, and a king's tax collector were all tied together in a shared worldview about how wealth should move and who should control it. In the end, the ancients didn't solve economic inequality or invent a perfect system, but they understood what we sometimes forget, that economies are human ecosystems. And like all ecosystems, they flourish only when balance is maintained. Ignore that balance, and even the strongest empire can fall grain by grain, coin by coin. Imagine you've traveled for days, maybe even weeks, through the dusty hills and olive groves of ancient Greece. You're not here for sightseeing or worship in the usual sense. You're here because you're desperate, your joints ache, your eyesight is fading, or perhaps something more mysterious troubles you, something the village doctors can't explain. And so you've come to the sanctuary of Asclepios at Epidaurus. Not a hospital, not a clinic, but a divine healing complex nestled in the hills of the Pelpine, where medicine and miracles meet. As you approach the sanctuary, the first thing you see isn't a grand temple, but a series of orderly structures. Vast gymnasiums, a stadium, even a massive theater. You wonder, is this really a place of healing? But then you cross the boundary into sacred ground where normal rules no longer apply. The air smells of burnt offerings and medicinal herbs. Pilgrims whisper prayers. Sacred dogs roam freely. And everywhere, yes, everywhere, there are snakes. Non-venomous, of course, but still unsettling. These are the sacred animals of Asclepios, believed to carry his healing power. A priest or therapist meets you and begins a ritual purification. You wash in sacred waters. You fast. You leave offerings, perhaps a coin of fruit or a small clay replica of the body part that needs healing. Then you're shown to the abaton, the dormitory where the real miracle is said to happen. You will sleep there tonight in hopes of receiving a divine dream. Asclepios himself may visit you in your sleep, touching your body with his staff, whispering cures or sending signs. There's no anesthesia, no scalpels, just faith ceremony, and a deeply ingrained belief that dreams are more than illusions. They are divine messages. For the ancient Greeks, healing wasn't just a physical process. It was spiritual, psychological, and symbolic. In Epidaurus, it was the ultimate destination for anyone seeking not just a cure, but transformation. This is not a place you leave unchanged. For many, it was the last hope. For others, it was the only place where medicine met meaning and sickness found something more than science could offer. Before Epidaurus became the ultimate healing destination, there was the myth, the divine figure behind the sanctuary. Asclepio. To understand the sanctuary, you must understand the god. Asclepios wasn't just another Olympian with a penchant for lightning or war. He was different. He healed, and that made him both revered and at times feared. According to legend, Asclepios was the son of Apollo. Yes, that Apollo god of music, prophecy, and yes, medicine, and a mortal woman named Coronis. The story doesn't begin happily. Coronis, while pregnant, was unfaithful. Apollo, enraged and betrayed, had her killed, but not before saving the unborn child from her funeral pee. That child was Asclepios, delivered by divine hands, bathed in fire and fate. From birth, Asclepios was destined for healing. Apollo entrusted him to the wise centaur Chiron, who taught him everything: surgery, herbology, anatomy, even the mystical arts of dream interpretation and incantations. But Asclepios didn't stop there. His talents surpassed mere teaching. He became so skilled he could cure any illness. Some say he even learned how to bring the dead back to life. That was a problem. The gods don't like balance being disturbed. Death, after all, was the realm of Hades. And if humans no longer died, what chaos would that unleash? Zeus, keeper of cosmic order, struck Asclepio down with a thunderbolt. Just like that, the healer was gone. But he didn't vanish from memory. The people mourned, honored, and then deified him. Over time, Asclepius transformed from a mythic doctor to a full-fledged god, worshipped not in fear but in hope. His emblem, a staff with a single snake coiled around it, remains a symbol of medicine to this day. And in sanctuaries across the Greek world, but most famously at Epidaurus, people gathered to seek his blessing. Unlike other gods who demanded blood or gold, Asclepios asked only for faith and maybe a small terracotta limb or a whispered prayer beneath the stars. In him, the Greeks found not just divine power, but a model for what healing could be. Compassionate, wise, and strangely personal. Epidaurus wasn't just a place to cure disease. It was a place to connect with something older, deeper, and yes, perhaps even divine. At the heart of the sanctuary of Asclepios was a ritual unlike anything in modern medicine. Incubation, or enkoias in Greek. No scalpels, no pills, no diagnosis from a man in a white coat. Instead, patients laid themselves down to sleep in the abaton, a sacred dormitory with one goal to dream. Because here dreams were prescriptions, and Asclepios, the divine physician, who made house calls while you slept. Before entering the abaton, every visitor underwent purification. This wasn't just for hygiene, it was to cleanse the soul. Fasting, bathing, abstaining from certain behaviors, and performing ritual sacrifices were required. Only when the body and spirit were deemed worthy could the patient lie beneath the temple roof surrounded by quiet stone columns and flickering oil lamps. Some patients brought small offerings like clay replicas of their aching limbs or afflicted organs. Others arrived with only hope. Then came the night. The abaton was filled with others, strangers all hoping to receive a message from the god. Sacred snakes slithered freely across the floor, considered holy messengers of Asclepios. Some accounts say these snakes even crawled across the bodies of the sick, transferring healing energy. It might sound horrifying now, but to an ancient Greek, this was a sign that Asclepios had noticed you. The dream itself was the crux of the treatment. Those fortunate enough to receive one often described it as vivid, symbolic, and strangely reassuring. Asclepios might appear in human form or as a radiant presence. He might speak clearly or act out a healing in a kind of divine performance. One dream might show the god performing surgery, another might be more cryptic, a walk through a garden, a sudden transformation, a snake coiling around the affected body part. In the morning, the patient would report the dream to a temple priest trained not in anatomy, but in dream interpretation. The priest would then offer guidance, perhaps prescribing a further ritual, a specific diet, or a series of acts to perform in honor of the god. Did it always work? Hard to say, but for the ancient Greeks, healing wasn't just physical, it was emotional, symbolic, and profoundly spiritual. They didn't expect miracles every time, but they believed that through dreams, the veil between mortal and divine could thin. And sometimes in the quiet of the abaton, healing came not through medicine, but through meaning. Epidaurus wasn't just sacred, it was stunning. The architecture of the sanctuary wasn't accidental or ornamental. It was part of the treatment. Everything from the columns to the pathways was designed to soothe the soul and elevate the mind. If you're picturing a dark monastic space, think again. Epidaurus was open, orderly, sunlit, a landscape where harmony itself seemed to dwell. At the center of it all was the Temple of Asclepios, the god's official residence. Built in the Doric style, it stood tall and proud, surrounded by sculpted friezes that told stories of healing and sacrifice. A massive statue of Asclepios, reportedly made of gold and ivory, once stood inside bearded calm and holding his snake-wrapped staff. Worshippers would enter the temple to make offerings and prayers, hoping to attract the god's favor before undergoing incubation. Next to the temple lay the tholos, a circular building whose exact purpose remains a mystery. But this wasn't just a pretty ruin. Ancient writers describe intricate underground passages and clever acoustics. Some believe it functioned as part of the dream incubation ritual, perhaps a place where sacred snakes were kept, or where initiates underwent secret rites. It added a layer of mystery to an already mystical experience. Then there was the abaton, the sleeping hall. Long and columned, its simple design belied its sacred power. This was where you lay in hope of a dream shoulder to shoulder with fellow pilgrims. Though it may seem humble today, the psychological effect was profound. Lying under the stars, surrounded by sacred architecture, believing you were close to the divine. It was enough to shift the soul, if not the body. But Epidaurus was more than its sacred core. There were baths, gymnasiums, stowers for walking and contemplation, and even a theater, the largest of its kind, seating over 13,000 dinae. Why a theater in a healing sanctuary? Because mental stimulation, laughter, and storytelling were part of the cure. Greeks understood that healing wasn't just about herbs and prayers. It was about environment, mood, and emotion. Even aesthetics were therapeutic. Let's clear something up. Epidaurus wasn't all dreams and divine visions. While Inkoyas was the central ritual, the sanctuary offered a surprisingly diverse range of physical treatments that might look oddly familiar to modern wellness centers. The ancients didn't separate the mystical from the practical. They combined them into a healing system that was ritualistic, symbolic, and surprisingly hands-on. Take, for example, therapeutic baths. Water was considered sacred, a purifier, not just for the body, but for the soul. Patients would bathe in spring-fed pools often before rituals as a form of cleansing. These weren't casual dips. They were part of the preparatory phase of healing. The Greeks believed that washing the body opened it to divine influence. It was step one in resetting the self. Then there was dietary regulation. The priests at Epidaurus often prescribed specific diets based on one's condition. Light foods, wine diluted with water, fasting. This wasn't about calorie counting. It was about balance. Ancient Greek medicine, influenced by Hippocratic thought, saw disease as imbalance and food as a tool to restore harmony. Ritual fasting before sleep in the Abaton was thought to make the dream state more potent and vivid. Physical activity was also encouraged. Patients walked in the colonnades, exercised in the gymnasia, and attended performances in the theater. Emotional release movement and even communal laughter were seen as integral to healing. They didn't have a word for mental health, but they understood that the mind mattered. And what better therapy than a well-timed Greek tragedy followed by a hearty laugh? And yes, there were snakes sacred to Asclepios. They symbolized renewal, wisdom, and the cyclical nature of life. Non-venomous serpents slithered through the temple and dormitory spaces. Their touch during sleep was believed to be a healing sign. If a snake approached you in the Abaton, the gods were listening. Terrifying. Maybe. But to the ancients, it was sacred reassurance. Even minor surgeries and wound care were performed. Though rudimentary by today's standards, they had tool salves made from honey and herbs, and even basic antiseptic knowledge. Combined with prayer and ritual, these treatments were holistic in the truest sense. Epidaurus welcomed everyone. Unlike some ancient temples where only elites passed through marble gates, the sanctuary of Asclepios was a beacon to all. Farmers, merchants, noble, slaves. Sickness didn't discriminate, and neither, it seemed, did the god of healing. That inclusivity made Epidaurus not just a place of worship, but a living archive of human suffering and hope. Patients arrived from all corners of the Greek world and beyond. Some limping, some blind, some carried in on makeshift stretchers by friends or family. Others came for chronic illnesses, mental torments, infertility, or unexplained maladies that baffled local physicians. If regular cures had failed, you came here. If no cure had been tried, you came anyway. And it wasn't just the sick who journeyed to Epidaurus. Often entire families would make the pilgrimage. Some brought their ill children. Others accompanied elderly relatives hoping for one last chance at relief. In this way, the sanctuary became a bustling mosaic of human stories, each one longing for a divine reply. We know about these people not just from archaeological remains, but from the inscriptions they left behind. On marble slabs near the Abaton, dozens of testimonies were carved in stone. Patient case studies, if you will. One recounts how a man with a paralyzed arm dreamed of Asclepio massaging it and awoke cured. Another tells of a blind woman who, after dreaming of the god touching her eyes, regained her vision by morning. Some stories are dramatic, even theatrical. Others are humble and short, but all of them pulse with the same theme: gratitude. These inscriptions served a purpose beyond recording. They were public proof evidence of miracles meant to inspire faith and attract future pilgrims. Imagine walking into the sanctuary frightened and sick, and reading the carved story of someone just like you who walked out healed. Hope, after all, is contagious. But not everyone was cured. For every miracle etched in stone, there were surely many unrecorded disappointments. And yet, even in failure, patients often left feeling transformed. Perhaps it was the sense of community, the ritual process, or the sheer beauty of the place. Perhaps it was simply being seen not as a lost cause, but as someone worthy of divine attention. Behind the tranquil rituals and marble columns of Epidaurus was a small army of people who kept the sacred machinery of healing running. This wasn't a free-for-all where pilgrims showed up and hoped for magic. There was a structure, an ancient theocratic healthcare system run by those who knew the rituals, interpreted dreams, and fed the snakes. At the top of the system were the priests of Asclepios, sometimes called therapeuti, literally attendants or servants of the god. These weren't priests in the modern sense. They acted as caretakers of both the temple and its patients, part spiritual guides, part psychologists, part ritual technicians. They were trained in the precise ceremonies and dream interpretations that formed the sanctuary's core. When a patient awoke from an incubation sleep, it was these priests who listened to their dreams and translated divine symbolism into actionable steps. But not everything was left to divine whispers. The sanctuary also employed physicians influenced by Hippocratic and Galenic methods. Some were probably hybrids trained in both practical medicine and sacred rites. They recommended diets, administered salves and massages, and even performed minor surgeries. These healers understood that while divine power could be invoked, practical measures couldn't be ignored. Then came the dream interpreters, specialized priests whose sole purpose was decoding the cryptic nocturnal messages from Asclepios. If you dreamt of snakes wrapping around your neck or of a god performing surgery with a golden blade, they determined what it meant, a change in behavior, a new offering, a ritual to repeat. Their interpretations could be gentle or alarming, but always carried weight. Support staff also played a role. Temple attendants cleaned the dormitories, managed the sacred animals, maintained the grounds, and guided newcomers through the process. Sacred musicians provided calming melodies in the background, especially during ceremonies. Even scribes were essential. They carved the miracle testimonies into stone, documenting the divine res of Asclepios, one healing at a time. These people weren't just functionaries. They were custodians of belief, carefully preserving the delicate balance between hope and expectation. At Epidaurus, healing didn't just come from the god. It came through human hands acting in sacred service. And for thousands of pilgrims, that structure gave the experience legitimacy. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography, a divine dance between God's dreams and very human helpers. It might seem strange to modern eyes, but one of the most iconic buildings at Epidaurus wasn't a temple or a hospital. It was a theater, a massive one. Carved into the hillside, the theater of Epidaurus could seat over 13,000 spectators, and is still praised today for its flawless acoustics and symmetry. But what was a theater doing in a sanctuary of healing? For the ancient Greeks, the answer was obvious. Drama was therapy. Attending a performance wasn't just about entertainment. It was a ritual, a cleansing of the soul, a process they called catharsis. The emotions evoked by Greek tragedies and comedies, grief, joy, anger, laughter, weren't distractions from illness. They were treatments. Watching a play about fate and suffering might help a grieving mother release her sorrow. A comedic performance could break the isolation of someone paralyzed by fear. This was group therapy, ancient style. The theater also connected patients to the mythic worldview that underpinned the sanctuary. Many of the plays performed dealt with themes of divine justice, human error healing, and redemption. Figures like Orestes, Electra, or even Asclepios himself might appear on stage. Their stories weren't just entertainment. They were mirrors showing the audience how even gods and heroes struggled with pain, loss, and rebirth. More than that, the theater served a social function. Pilgrims came from all over the Mediterranean, each with their own dialects, traditions, and gods. In the theater, they sat side by side, laughed together, cried together. That shared emotional experience helped break down barriers. You were no longer a stranger with an illness. You were part of a healing community. Scholars believe performances at Epidaurus were carefully timed to coincide with major religious festivals for Asclepios after sacrifices, rituals, and dream incubation. Patients could attend the theater and reflect on what they had experienced. It was the final act of a multi-day therapeutic journey, one that involved the body, the spirit, and now the emotions. When you walk through the ruins of Epidaurus today, it's hard not to feel the weight of history pressing softly against the silence. The columns may be broken, the statues weathered, but the spirit of the sanctuary still lingers in the air. And what it represents is something the modern world is just beginning to remember. That healing is more than a prescription. It's an experience. For centuries, the sanctuary of Asclepios thrived as the premier healing center of the ancient world. Other ascepa existed in places like CS and Pergamon, but Epidaurus was the heart. Even the Romans, practical as they were, respected its power. The sanctuary remained active until the rise of Christianity, when pagan temples were shuttered or repurposed. The sacred snakes vanished. The dream halls went quiet. And Asclepios, once a god, was demoted to myth, but his legacy didn't die. The symbol of Asleo's staff coiled with a single serpent still endures as the global emblem of medicine. The idea of holistic treatment of addressing the mind, body, and spirit echoes through modern wellness movements, psychology, and even palliative care. Epidaurus anticipated things we now recognize: the role of belief in recovery, the importance of environment, and the healing power of human connection. And let's not ignore what the sanctuary teaches us about the power of ritual. The fasting, the bathing, the prayers, the storytelling, all created a structure in which suffering had meaning. It wasn't random, it was part of a narrative. For many pilgrims, that alone was transformative. Even today, patients often report better outcomes when they feel seen, heard, and guided through a journey, not just treated as a symptom on a clipboard. Epidaurus also reminds us of something deeply human: the need to believe. Whether in gods or in science, in dreams or in data, people will always seek a story that helps them make sense of illness and health. That's not superstition, that's survival. So as we stand among the sunlit ruins, we're left with more than admiration for ancient architecture. We're left with a question: what if healing was sacred again? What if hospitals offered not just treatment but meaning? What if medicine remembered the wisdom of the past? At Epidaurus, they didn't just cure bodies, they restored hope. And sometimes that was the greatest miracle of all.